Hi guys, Buildzoid here, and today I'm going to be sharing my thoughts on the various Z390 motherboards that I've actually had a chance to work with. So, let's get into it, shall we? So starting off with the EVGA Z390 Dark. So I did not pay for my Dark. EVGA sent me a Dark for free, and I really like my Dark, but it is very expensive, and I can't really recommend it because the Dark is very much it's a it's kind of a one-trick pony as far as boards go, and that, is, in my opinion, not exactly acceptable when you're spending 475 quid for a motherboard. This thing basically has... So, first let's start with the good things before I start complaining about it. So you've got a power button, reset button, postcode. The postcode actually doubles as a voltage readout, temperature readout. Unfortunately, EVGA does not have the same upgraded voltage sensing stuff that like Asus has, and they also don't have the ISL 69138 accessible to any monitoring software, which means you can't actually get DiSense voltages. There's triple BIOS. One of the BIOS chips is socketed. You have a dip switch for enabling, disabling PCIe slots as well as M.2 slots. It's got, what else is there? It's got one of the best VRMs on Z390, both thermally and in terms of voltage regulation. Actually, out of the motherboards I've tested, it is straight up the best VRM for voltage regulation, period. There's no other motherboard that gets close to it on transient response. So, yeah, it's just like, well, no, the Gene gets close, but this still has an edge over that. And this runs really, really cool. So the VRM on this thing's great. You've got a safe boot button, you've got a clear CMOS button on the rear IO, and as well as in the sort of OC corner of the motherboard, there's a ton of troubleshooting LEDs that aren't just the postcode to indicate if all of your various voltages are present. So you've also got Pro-bit connectors right here, which this is my this is my favorite implementation of like voltage monitoring capabilities. Voltage monitoring hookups. So yeah, this thing is like the overclocking features it comes with are great. Now let's talk about the bad stuff. So this board is rather picky. Well, actually, no. I'd say it's fair to call it extremely picky with memory. So Micron Revision E that I have, so the crucial 3000 megahertz CL15 memory sticks I have, those sticks will do well over 4000 megahertz on any motherboard that's capable. Like those are memory sticks good for over 4000 megahertz. The Dark doesn't do that with them. It doesn't go over 4000 megahertz with those sticks. So that sucks. My Corsair Dominator RGB memory on the Dark also doesn't go over 4000 megahertz. What else is there? My 2x16 Corsair Dominators on the Dark top out at like, if you put a little bit of work into it, you'll easily do like 3800, but you won't go over that. So because of that, so that's like 3 different sets of memory that I've just listed off that the Dark doesn't like. And that's a problem because this thing's 475 quid. On the other hand, I also have a huge amount of B-Die from like G-Skill, Team Group, G-Skill, Team Group, Patria, and HyperX. And with those memory kits, the Dark will go easily up to 4800 megahertz and it'll do great timings. So yeah, like those memory kits, it'll work really well with. But then it's like the RGB Dominators, which are actually the best memory in my collection. Like those are the best B-Die sticks I have. Yeah, they don't like the Dark very much, or more like the Dark doesn't like them. The Micron Micron Revision E-memory sticks I have, Dark doesn't like those either. The 16 gig B-Die I have, Dark doesn't like it either. Admittedly, like that, the Dark's not the exception in not liking them, but it would be nice if it liked them, in my opinion, considering how expensive it is. So that's kind of the thing, is just like the Dark is very much a case of if you want to run 16 gigs of RAM from G-Scale, Team Group, and I think maybe Corsair Vengeance LPX sticks might work, but I've not tried any, so I don't know. So yeah, the Dark's just kind of like if you want to run 2x8 memory configurations at insane speeds and it's B-Die, the Dark's great. If you want to run really kind of anything else, my experience is just kind of like, don't do that. It doesn't like that. So yeah, and as for why that is, it's entirely down to the BIOS. The Dark's BIOS is just not tuned for a very large variety of memory, and so that's what you end up with is theoretically, if you spend, lots and lots of time fiddling with BIOS settings, you could probably get most of the memory to work proper. Like most of the memory kits that I said don't really, like the Dark doesn't like them, you can get them to actually go, like you would be able to get them to go faster. But the thing is, the Dark also, like its BIOS is, the way EVGA has the BIOS set up is it hides a lot of the advanced settings. And in a lot of situations, I'd say that's fine because you actually, like, the way EVGA sets up a lot of those settings for you is fine. Like, they're well configured out of the box. But when you run into a memory kit that the Dark doesn't automatically support, you're kind of screwed. So it's just like, yeah, I wish I could say it does everything, but really it's just like it's only really good when you're trying to push, 16 gigs of BDI, and if you try to really do anything else, it's not that great. So, yeah, and 16 gigs of specific BDI, because if you try to run like my RGB dominators, yeah, it doesn't like those. So, yeah, I'm honestly kind of like I still like the Dark. Like it's still just like at the end of the day, the overclocking experience on this board, when you have a good, like if you have a memory kit that the board works with well, it's great. But if you have anything else, it's just like, well, it's easy to work with. That doesn't really change the fact that it's just not going to go past a certain frequency if you don't have the right memory sticks. So that's rather annoying. So, moving on, we have the Maximus 11 Gene. So, this is in sort of the same situation as the Dark in my experience, where it's like it's extremely picky with memory kits. Though less so, slightly less so, but it's still rather picky with memory kits. It still doesn't do a great job of like high frequency on my 2x16 memory kit. However, it does add a few extra it adds retry. And I prefer the ASUS implementation of the safe boot button to the EVGA implementation, because EVGA's safe boot button works like go to the last known good settings, and that can sometimes mean like you press safe boot and it's putting you back to like if you've previously had 4800 megahertz somewhat stable, yeah, safe boot will put you back to 4800 megahertz, which is just like, well, it'll try more like it won't put you back to 4800 megahertz. It'll boot at 4800 megahertz on the memory, which is just like, yeah, that's not exactly ideal all the time, Whereas on this board, you hit the safe boot button and it boots at like stock, which is like, that's what you want, right? It won't wipe the settings, but it'll boot you at stock. And that's awesome to have a button that behaves that way. So, yeah, I really prefer the safe boot button implementation from Asus. At the same time, the overall overclocking experience on the Gene, in my opinion, is far less smooth, just because, I think EVGA's BIOS is actually better laid out than the Asus BIOS. Now, admittedly, the Asus board doesn't hide any settings, it just calls them stupid things. Like, for example, the Asus BIOS has all the on-die termination resistances labeled as clocks, because, calling them ohms would be too mainstream, I guess, or something. So, yeah, and that's normal on all Asus motherboards. And it's just things like that with the Asus BIOS, where, like, Asus relabels certain voltages to things that, like, if you try to look up that voltage in the Intel datasheets, you won't find it, because Asus just randomly made up a different name for it, and that's just what they call it in their BIOS. And it's just like, well, Asus, wouldn't it be nice if you, like, actually followed Intel spec? Right? But yeah, at the same time, I can't deny that the Gene is a very capable board, as long as you're running, 2x8 memory kits that the Gene likes, which is the same situation the Dark is in. And it might actually have some, like, there might be some 2x16 kits that work well with the Gene, but my 2x16 doesn't work well with it. I'm not sure, like, the Dark might also have, like, there might also be 2x16 kits for the Dark that work well, but I've just not tested any. I'm not sure how this does with Micron Revision E yet, because I've not tried it, but yeah. That's the Gene. Like, the thing is, it's also way cheaper than the Dark. Also, the VRM on this can just about keep up with the Dark in terms of at least the minimums on this are basically just as good as the Dark. The overshoot is worse, but it's not really a big deal because it doesn't affect your stability. So yeah, and thermally, the VRM on this is great. Now, the one downside to, like, the biggest complaint I've seen from, like, not people who are me for the Gene is that it's an MATX motherboard with only 2 PCIe slots. And I gotta agree with those people. Like, honestly, for whatever ungodly reason, Asus decided that instead of making an MATX motherboard that's the normal size of 244 millimeters by 244 millimeters, and then having the extra space to add an extra PCIe slot down here, they decided to make a motherboard that's 244 millimeters by 226. Which is just like, why is the board 18 millimeters shorter? I mean, less tall. Well, shorter. Yeah, it's 18 millimeters shorter. It's just like, and you sacrifice an entire PCIe slot for that. And it's just like, why? What was the point of doing that? Isn't that really dumb? And yeah, and the PCIe slot layout as a result of that actually suffers because optimally, I'd say you'd want to have your full size 16x slot at the top, and then then maybe a 1x slot and then another full size 16x slot at the very bottom so that you can run a configuration like GPU, 2-slot GPU, capture card, maybe networking card, or an M.2 expansion card, or whatever, right? But this thing is almost as bad as an ITX motherboard in terms of its PCIe slot configuration, and it's just like, yeah, I can totally understand why some people might not like that. But at the same time, this is the best VRM you can get on an MATX motherboard. So, if you are going to be doing an MATX build with just 2 PCIe cards, I'd say this is kind of your best option, especially if you really want to push a 9900K. At the same time, this does top out at in my experience, it tops out at 3800 megahertz for 2x16. So it ends up in the same issue, it ends up in the same frequency as the Dark, basically. So yeah, that's the thing. So the Gene is just kind of like, as far as MATX boards goes, you're not going to find a better one, but I can't really, it's far from perfect in my opinion, but yeah, it's like, as the funny thing is, it's also actually really capable as an extreme overclocking board. It does have all of the LN2 overclocking features that you would get on like a Maximus 11 Apex or even a Maximus 11 Extreme from Asus. So, if you just want an alternative to the Apex, this is the alternative, especially because they don't sell Apexes anymore. So that's rather annoying. So yeah, that's my thoughts on the Gene. So it's not bad enough. It's not bad enough that I wouldn't recommend it, but at the same time, it's just, I wish it was better. I really do. Now then, Z390 Aorus Master. So this thing is actually noticeably worse in terms of voltage regulation compared to the Dark and the Gene. So this isn't quite so good at CPU overclocking as the other two, but it's not significant enough that you'd be losing huge amounts of frequency. It seems to be about 20 millivolts within the 20 millivolts worse within the limitations of my measuring equipment. The memory overclocking on this thing on 2x8, it tops out around 4266, whereas both the Gene and the Dark can go all the way up to 4800 quite easily. But this, when you want to run 32 gigs of RAM, this thing is absolutely great at that. It'll do 4000, 4133, 4266, and if your CPU's up to it, it'll even do 4400 megahertz on 32 gigs of RAM, which is great. The main issue is finding a CPU capable of doing that, but yeah, so the memory overclock, as an all-around motherboard, I think this is great because it also has dual BIOS. It has a it has dual BIOS, it has a single BIOS mode. You can manually select between the BIOS chips. You've got a clear CMOS button on the rear I/O. The VRM on this runs cool, so you're not going to be limited thermally when running the 9900K. It's just you're going to need a little bit more voltage than if you were on a Gene or a Dark. What else is there? And the memory overclocking, if you were running 32 gigs, as an all-around motherboard, this thing just kind of makes sense to me. Because it's just if I was building a system with a 9900K or a 9900KS and I wanted to run 32 gigs of RAM and I also wanted a, decent number of PCIe slots, and also this has dual BIOS, which the Gene doesn't have, which I think is really dumb on the Gene. Is just if that board was a little bit taller, they could have probably fit a second BIOS chip on it. But Asus. So, but still, it's just so the Master is, in my opinion, just a really nice all-around board. Unfortunately, I've not tested any other motherboards in this price range, so I've not tested the MSI Meg Ace or the Maximus 11 Hero to give you a, like, so I can't tell you like if those would in any way be better, but my experience with the Master, like I overall like the Master. So that's kind of just, you know, it was just like, yeah, I really don't see any issues with it. The BIOS is, you know, easy enough to use. I don't know. Like, I don't really have, like, I wish the voltage regulation was a little bit better. At the same time, you know, like, the Dark and the Gene are, well, the Gene's VRM really isn't that insane in terms of how it's built. Like, but I also don't think it's down to the doublers. I think it's just the way Asus has their power plane. Like, I think it's a power plane capacitor configuration thing that's giving the Gene an edge over the Master. Because also I've tested an ITX Gigabyte board, which actually beats the Master and actually beats all of the other Gigabyte boards as well. And it's just like, well, that doesn't make any bloody sense, but hey, you know, that's what the measurements say. So I'm not really going to argue with them. And the only thing that I can think of where it's like that, this is why that ITX board could have an advantage is the ITX board just has a completely different power plane from everything else on the ATX in the ATX form factor. So yeah, still like, you know, if again, like if I was just doing a daily build, I would honestly go for the Master. I really don't see anything wrong with it. You could also maybe drop down to something like the Aorus Ultra. Though with the Ultra, like the thing is this actually, I'm not sure, because here's the thing. I tested a 4-layer, like this board shares the memory configuration of the Master, but the VRM is actually off of the Z390 Pro. And the problem there is like in my testing, the Z390 Pro's VRM has is actually significantly worse in terms of voltage regulation than either the Master or really any other board I tested. Like is again worse than the Master, so it's just like there you might actually start noticing CPU overclocking limits due to the voltage. But I'm not, like, this board is on a 6-layer PCB, whereas that's on a 4-layer. And if my theory is correct that it's just like a power plane thing that's causing the Pro to have, and as well as the Master, to have not that great transient response, then this being a 6-layer would actually perform very differently to the Pro, which is a 4-layer, just because the power planes are different. So yeah, because of that, I can't really pass judgment on this one. I wish... Well, actually, I don't wish I had tested it. I wish I had the data for it, but testing it actually, like, I don't have the time to test it. That's the issue. So I wish I had the information. I don't. And I'm not going to be getting it because Z390 at this point is pretty, like, it's a soon to be very dead platform. So anyway, moving on, we've got the ASRock Z390 PhantomGaming ITX. This thing is kind of... So this does a better job of voltage regulation than the Z390 Aorus Master. However, this is a 5-phase VRM jammed under one little heatsink. Admittedly, that has a heat pipe, but that heat pipe really doesn't do that much. So this VRM runs hot, and you're going to need a fan. And for ITX motherboard standards, this thing isn't actually that incredible in terms of memory overclocking. The BIOS is not bad. To use and navigate, the BIOS really isn't a disaster. But at the same time, you know, if you run 2x16, this motherboard hits the exact same limits as the Dark and the Gene. So at this point, you're like, Buildzoid, is there any motherboard that doesn't hit those limits? Yeah, there is. We're getting to it. It's even cheaper. Hard to believe, I know. And that's why I'm so annoyed that they're like the cheapest motherboard that I've tested has the best support for 2x16 memory configurations. Like, you've got to be freaking kidding me. But anyway, so 2x16 on this is going to top out around 3800 megahertz, though because the BIOS on this is actually really well labeled. Like, ASRock has a lot, like, ASRock actually has pretty decent explanations next to all of the different memory controller settings. I've actually managed to get this thing to 4000 megahertz. Unfortunately, on the Dark, the memory controller settings, like, they're not very well labeled, so it's just like, well, I don't know what to do with them. So there's a lot of them, and it's like, because they have them just as abbreviations. If they at least told me, like, this is roughly what they did, it's just like, I'd actually maybe be able to do something with them, but no. Whereas the ASRock BIOS, like, it just has like straight up descriptions of basically every memory controller setting. Also, they don't hide a bunch of settings on the for the memory of this motherboard. So yeah, but 2x16, generally you're probably, like, unless you put a lot of time into it, you're still going to stop at like 37, 33, 3800. 2x8, this motherboard tops out around 4400 megahertz, which is not the best for a 2-DIMM motherboard in general. So, like, this thing has great voltage regulation, VRM thermals that by ITX standards are fine, but ITX motherboards just run hot in general. And then the memory overclocking is not the best, is the best way to put it, right? It's not terrible, but yeah, I'm not sure. Like, it's hard to recommend the board when it's just like I've never seen it do over 4400. Well, yeah, I've never seen it do over 4400. Actually, no, I had it at like 4466, but that's BCLK, so that doesn't really count. Because by that logic, the Dark and the MSI ITX did 4900, so I'm not really counting that. Anyway, so yeah, that's the Z390 PhantomGaming ITX. Is just like, as far as ITX boards go, it's a solid option. It's just, if you actually want the best memory overclocking capabilities, this doesn't have them, but it does have the best voltage regulation. Like the VRM on this thing is actually very, very capable as far as the voltage regulation goes. It's just the temperatures kind of suck. What else do we have? So next we have the Z390i Aorus Pro Wi-Fi. So this is actually also, this is the best voltage regulation on any Gigabyte motherboard I've tested. Yep, this is what it looks like. Unfortunately, this also runs insanely hot because this VRM, it kind of runs into the same, like ASRock, this VRM right here has the issue of like, it's just all of the power stages are jammed right next to each other under one little heatsink. Well, this heatsink is smaller and the power stages are weaker. So this runs even hotter, and like where this you can get away with like a 2000 RPM fan, or even less RPM than that will actually do. This right here, I've had, like, if I'm not mistaken, I had the fan cranked well over 4000 RPM to keep this VRM from overheating while running a 9900K. So, no. Just no. I would not get this. Also, the memory overclocking on this thing is not any, like, 16... This is actually the worst with the 16 gig DIMMs out of all of the 2-DIMM motherboards, because that's the only place where the 16 gig DIMMs make a ton of sense, in my opinion. So out of all the 2-DIMM motherboards I've tried 16 gig DIMMs on, yeah, this one's the worst. As it tops out at 3600. Instead of the 3733 or 3800 that some of the other boards do. Yeah, this stops at 3600. The VRM is ridiculously hot, and it's just like, I would not use it. Like, that's the thing, is just like, I would just not get this board. Which, I kind of, like, I think if Gigabyte had just, like, this would have been, like, if they had a better VRM heatsink, then I could probably recommend this, but, well, actually, no, the memory overclocking is still a disaster, so it's just kind of, yeah. Not like, just, yeah, out of the ITX boards, I would definitely not go for this. And the funny thing is, this is a board that Gigabyte straight up sent to me for free. So, but yeah, it's just like, it's a bad board. So what am I going to tell you about it, right? The Master's good, but that right there isn't. It just runs way too hot. And there's nothing really redeeming about it in general. So yeah, anyway, next we get the Z390 Aorus Pro. So this thing, the voltage regulation on it is pretty bad. It's the best way to put it. So where the Master and the Master is like 20 millivolts behind the Gene and the Dark, this is 40 millivolts behind the Gene and the Dark. And that's significant at that point. And the memory overclocking here also isn't that great. If you run, like, basically this tops out around 37, 33 megahertz on every memory configuration I've tried. So yeah, that's kind of that. Like, the only, like, major advantage this board has is that the VRM runs really cool. So it can handle a lot of power. It's just not very good at regulating it. So yeah, that's kind of that. Honestly, like, here's the thing. If you don't want to have to zip tie a fan to your VRM, then this is actually kind of the board for you in this price range, because this is the only one where it's like, yeah, this, you'll get away with not this also has working temperature sensors, which some of the other motherboards in this price range don't. Well, actually, There's only one motherboard I've tested that doesn't have working VRM temperature sensors. So, well, I think the Dark's temperature sensor. Well, I can't remember if the Dark's temperature sensors are accessible. And I think that no, the Gene has I can't remember if the Gene has temperature sensors. But the thing is, both the Gene and the Dark have VRMs good enough that it doesn't matter if they have working temperature sensors or not. So there, I don't care. Similarly, this actually, if this didn't have working temperature sensors, it wouldn't really be a big deal. The VRM doesn't really run hot. So, yeah, that's kind of the thing. So if you're overclocking on this motherboard, you're basically forced to use offset voltage because otherwise you're... Like, there's really no LLC setting at which this motherboard works great, like, works particularly great. Whereas unlike the Master, if you just use like high LLC, then the Master behaves pretty normally. The Master's biggest problem with the LLC settings is I wish the turbo setting was like, there's too much of a gap between the turbo setting and the high setting, but yeah, there's not really anything you like. Well, funnily enough, I think Gigabyte could actually put out a BIOS update to put like a high plus setting quite easily, because if I remember correctly, when I was checking the programming of the voltage controller, that thing goes from like, I think they have it set like 35% droop for turbo and then 75% droop for high, which is just like, why isn't there a 50%? Right? Where did the 50% setting go? Come on, guys. What's wrong with 50%? Anyway, this, however, actually, like, the LLC settings on this are actually a bit, like, the steps in the LLC are a bit better on this. It's just that the voltage regulation is just, like, not great. So, yeah. And the memory overclocking is also not spectacular. Now, admittedly, well, no, because these days you can get even, like, 4400 megahertz CL19 kits cheap, right? Like, that's the thing. Like, you can get 4400 megahertz kits for not that much money. So I think, yeah, that's not necessarily a great sacrifice to make on the memory speed. Anyway, what else do we have? So, yeah, that's the Pro. So, like, the Pro basically runs cool, but not the best at overclocking. And then we have the exact opposite of that. Then we have the Z390-A. Runs insanely hot, but can overclock, though... yeah, and it is like, this runs basically just as hot as the ITX motherboards, which is just like, good job, Asus. Good job. Well, okay, it's not quite as bad as the ITX boards, but it's still bad enough that you need a fan on the VRM, and there's no temperature sensor, which is infuriating. However, the memory is capable of doing 4000 megahertz, even if you're on 2 DIMMs or 4x8, so... You know, you basically get almost the same memory overclocking performance as if you had the Z390 Aorus Master. It's just that the VRM on this runs ridiculously hot. The VRM on this is also about 10 millivolts better than the Master, so it slots in between like the Dark, the Gene, and the Master. So it's a little bit better on voltage regulation. That's not really, it's not a significant advantage, but the temperatures on this kind of suck. And yeah, also, I had this board shut down twice during testing. So it does have over temperature protection. It's just that there's no temperature sensor for the VRM, because the voltage controller Asus uses on this motherboard is too cheap to give you temperature readouts in software, monitoring software, which is just like, good job, Asus. That's exactly what we need. Because the thing is like, if you spent... like, the controller they're using is probably like 50 cents instead of $1.50. And it's just like, well, admittedly, this board right now is ridiculously cheap, but yeah, it's still just, you need a fan. Like, you just need a fan on the VRM, because there's no way to know what temperature it's at until it randomly shuts down on you. So that's kind of the thing with the Dash A, is just, yeah, you know, you can go with the Pro and not worry about temperatures, or you can go with the Dash A and you might be like, you'll be able to push higher memory speeds. You'll be able to push, well, yeah, get slightly lower voltage. Well, the funny thing is just like the slightly lower voltage, you'd be like, oh, so the VRM doesn't need to deliver as much power. Well, that doesn't really help the VRM when it's like, this has 50% more VRM than this does. That's basically the issue with why this runs so incredibly hot. So, yeah, it's just like, I'd go for this and just zip tie a fan to the VRM, because like if you don't care about aesthetics, that's just not really an issue. And also, if you're buying this motherboard, then you probably don't care about aesthetics anyway, because I think this looks horrendous. But well, this isn't exactly the most prettiest board ever either, but at least it's like monochrome and doesn't have weird square things going on. So like, I really don't like, if these were solid stripes, I'd be like, okay, sure. But this is just like, this is just visual noise as far as I'm concerned, and it's annoying. So, like, yeah, I just find like these kinds of patterns for the PCB prints are just annoying as far as I'm concerned. So, yeah, still. So basically, zip tie a fan to this, and it's better than the Pro. But if you don't zip tie a fan to this, then the Pro is better because this doesn't overheat. Yeah. Also, this has a power button, which is nice, and the troubleshooting LEDs are color-coded. So, a couple advantages. So, it's also cheaper, though. Like, right now, it's also cheaper. So, yeah, I'll just leave it up to you. Pick your own poison. Also, the Z390-A, as far as I know, uses a very similar VRM to, like, the Z390-F. Though this has different heat sinks. So, these heat sinks might actually be substantial enough to fix the VRM issues, but like the thermal issues, but yeah. I'm really not a fan, like this just runs too hot. I'm not sure how this does though, so because I've not tested that. So anyway, moving on from the Z390-A, we get to the Z390i. Where is it? Gaming Edge AC. So this is the thing, is just like, so you have the PhantomGaming ITX, which has a voltage regulation advantage. Like, this is one of the best again, like, this is top 3 for voltage regulation. So this actually beats the Asus Z390-A slightly, very slightly, but it does beat it. So now this is a top 3 motherboard for voltage regulation. Both of these need a fan, and the reason why it's both of these, because like technically this VRM is a bit more efficient, but ASRock, the thermal management that they're doing is just bad compared to what MSI is doing. So this is 5 phases, and they're just jammed right next to each other under one heatsink. MSI, on the other hand, has 3 phases under this heatsink and the other 3 phases under that heatsink. So they've spread the heat of the VRM across a lot more PCB, and the end result is that the VRM actually runs at similar temperatures to this VRM, even though this one is significantly more efficient, because this one just, like, all of the heat this produces, sure, overall it's less heat, except all of that heat is produced in a much smaller amount of area, so ultimately the temperatures between these two work out to be roughly the same. This does have a voltage regulation disadvantage. It's about 10-20 millivolts, I want to say. I think this ties the Aorus Master for voltage regulation. Actually, no, I think it ties the... Wait, I'm just going to look. Gaming Edge AC, 1.42 volts. Oh, yeah, it's 10 millivolts. So it's 10 millivolts worse than the PhantomGaming ITX, but where this blows the PhantomGaming ITX away is the memory overclocking. This will go easily up to 4800 megahertz. Like, this motherboard, like, you're going to need to, if you want to max out the memory overclocking capabilities of this board, you're going to have to bin CPUs, which is also true of, like, the Gene and the Dark. So the memory overclocking here is incredible. There's one issue with it. There's no VTT DDR voltage control. So if you want to do, like, high voltage benching with some of the less flexible B-die kits, like most of my collection, this motherboard can't go above like 1.9-ish volts on those, because they get really unstable if you don't turn down the VTT DDR voltage, which you can't do on this motherboard, because it doesn't give you the option to do that. 16 gig DIMM support on this thing is also amazing. It'll easily do 4000 or even 4133 megahertz on 32 gigs of RAM. So if you were trying to do like a ITX build with 32 gigs of memory, I'd go for this. Like, I'd honestly go for this, just because it like, the thing is, it's also cheaper than the ASRock board. So at that point, it's just like, it costs less, it has better memory overclocking capabilities, the VRM thermals are basically the same, and, you know, the CPU overclocking advantage of the PhantomGaming ITX is really not that significant. Like, it's not a big advantage, so you may as well just go for this instead. So, yeah, that's my thoughts on that. Is just like this honestly, like, I'd argue if you don't need more PCIe slots, this is kind of the best Z390 motherboard in general, because as long as you're okay with zip tying a fan to the VRM, right? Because you can run 32 gigs at over 4,000. You can run 16 gigs at well over 4,400, or 4,600 should be quite easy actually. So you can run insane speeds on 16 gigs. You can run accept good speeds on 32 gigs. The CPU overclocking is acceptable. Yeah, it's just like, this is kind of, and it's cheap. It's really, really cheap. You just need a fan on the VRM, which kind of is true of a lot of more motherboards in this price range anyway, except like the Aorus Pro and the Aorus Elite. The Elite uses the same VRM as the Pro, so yeah. That's kind of that's my thoughts on all the different Z390, motherboards that I've actually tested. Is just like, this this is kind of the like, from a purely like, if you're purely performance oriented, this is kind of the best bang for the buck. If you don't mind the whole I have to zip tie a fan to the VRM. Which you don't actually, like, depending on your case configuration. Like, if you have a fan that's actually like in line with the VRM heatsinks, then you don't even need to like zip tie a fan to the heatsinks. But it's just like a lot of cases, the fans are positioned that they're just above the VRM heatsinks, so they don't actually move any airflow over the heatsinks themselves. The air is all moving like several centimeters above the heat sinks, and it's just like, well, that's not where the heat sink is, so that airflow is completely and utterly useless to the VRM. Yeah, like, honestly, it's kind of ridiculous how good this board is to me. Like, the thing is like, I'm just going off of my test results and my experience, and it's just like, this thing is insanely impressive. I just wish MSI built this exact board, but in they should stretch this into an MATX and give it a bigger VRM. Like, that would, in my opinion, be like the perfect Z390 motherboard. It's this, but with a bigger VRM. And it doesn't need to be massively bigger. Okay, it just needs to not be a dinky, like, actually, they could do like the Asus thing and just put a bunch of extra power stages. Well, this is actually on dual NFETs, so they could just put a bunch of extra dual NFETs in parallel, which actually, that's not even an Asus thing. Like, board vendors have been doing that for ages and ages and ages, and GPU manufacturers too. So yeah, it's just like, this needs a slightly more substantial VRM, and then it would be perfect. But even then, it's just like, if you just, do something about the VRM cooling, it's great. So yeah, that's my thoughts on all the different Z390 motherboards I tested. Unfortunately, I've not really tested that many of them. And so I guess I'll do some noteworthy sort of shoutouts, I guess. This has 10, well, actually, no. Like, if you want 10 gig LAN, then you should just look at this. Pcie Ultimate. I don't know how the VRM on this performs. Hopefully it's not terrible, but if I was judging by the one ASRock, the one ATX ASRock motherboard I've tested, it doesn't count. It's just not fair to use that board, because I don't think it's representative whatsoever. This has 10 gig LAN, which is kind of cool. If you want a lot of PCIe lanes, then you have the Z390 Pro from Asus. This has a PLX chip under that heatsink right there, so you can actually, like, this actually has 32 PCIe lanes, which is pretty cool. There's a Supermicro motherboard that also does that, but I don't think, that's not listed on this version of, that's not on the, I think it's that one, isn't it? Or no, it's this one. Yeah, it's this one. So this Supermicro board has a PLX chip as well, but the VRM on this looks really anemic. So I'd actually take the Asus board instead. What else is there? Oh yeah, there's the Gigabyte Z390 Designare, which has Thunderbolt 3. Or is it Thunderbolt 3? It has Thunderbolt something. So yeah, if you want Thunderbolt, that's available on this. And that's the same 6-layer PCB as the Master, just with the VRM of the Ultra. So yeah, in terms of memory overclocking, that should also be a really solid board if you're pushing like 32 gigs. And I think that's all of the ones I really want to point out as, like, especially. Yeah, because the thing is that in the lower price ranges, it's hard for me to go, like, this is going to be a good board, because it's just, like, it really depends on, like, too many variables when you look at the cheap motherboards. So, because it's just, you never know. You just never know. It's like, maybe it runs like, disproportionately hot to what it is. Or in the case, like, I tested the Z370 Extreme 4, and that thing's just terrible in terms of voltage regulation. Like, it is so bad that it's, admittedly, I had a second-hand board, but the funny thing is, the Z390 Extreme 4 has a different voltage controller from the Z370 version, and it's just like, well, I wonder why they changed the voltage controller, because I like the original one wasn't exactly terrible, at least not on paper, because that's an ISL 69138, and that's the same controller that you find on, like, the Z390 Dark. So, yeah. Anyway, oh, and I guess one thing I will point out is the MSI Meg Z390 Godlike, this doesn't have a PLX chip, so you can't actually, like, this, if you try to populate on all the PCIe slots on this, they will run 8x, 4x, 4x, 4x. So this is not a viable motherboard for, like, having a ton of PCIe devices, because it doesn't have a PLX chip. So just wanted to point that out. Also, this rear IO is stupid. And anyway, so there's the various, well, no, I'll just stop here, because, like, I think that's a cool board, and I think that's a cool board as well. Though this is on the same VRM as the Gene, so that's noteworthy. And I think this is a cool board if you want to run, like, 32 gigs of RAM and want a really solid VRM, and a bunch of overclocking features that, like, the Aorus Extreme doesn't have, like safe boot and retry. But yeah, anyway, so there, I'll end the video here, because now it's just over 40 minutes. So yeah, that's it for the video. Thanks for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave any comments, questions, suggestions down in the comment section below. And if you'd like to support what I do here with actually hardcore overclocking, I do have a Patreon where you can support me directly, so that, you know, I can go out and buy motherboards, because, well, ASRock and Asus sure as hell aren't sending me any. And what else was there? Right. Or you can support me through Teespring, where you can just buy, like, shirts, stickers, posters, you know, the typical YouTuber merch type stuff. And there's a link to that down in the description as well. So yeah, that's it for the video. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.